July 1870. A locomotive named the Jupiter crawls up a grade so steep the wheels slip on the rails. Inside the passenger car, a woman from Boston presses her face to the glass and watches the ground fall away beneath her. She is 2 miles above sea level. The air is thin enough that her ears pop every few minutes, and through the window she can see straight down a cliff face that drops 1,000 feet to a river that looks no wider than a silver thread. The train rounds a bend carved into solid granite. For a moment, the track seemed to end in open air. Then the mountainside swallows the train whole as it plunges into a tunnel blasted through the spine of the continent. 30 seconds of absolute darkness, the smell of coal smoke and wet stone, then daylight again, and a valley so vast it takes her breath away. She has no idea that 17 men died building the quarter mile of track she just crossed, that the tunnel she passed through took 8 months to drill by hand, that the roadbed beneath her was carved from frozen rock by workers who earned $1.50 a day and slept in canvas tents through Rocky Mountain winters. This is the story of how America built 500 miles of railroad through the most unforgiving terrain on the continent. Before bulldozers, before jackhammers, before dynamite was reliable enough to trust. They did it with hand drills, black powder, nitroglycerin, and the bodies of men who history has mostly forgotten. And if you think you understand what that actually means, you don't. Not yet. Because we're going to walk every mile of that route together. We're going to stand where they stood, see what they saw, and understand exactly what it cost to punch a railroad through the Rocky Mountains in the 1860s. Let's start with a simple question that took a decade and thousands of lives to answer. Why couldn't they just go around? If you look at a map of the United States in 1860, the Rocky Mountains look like a wall. They stretch from Canada to Mexico, and at their widest point, they span 300 miles of peaks, canyons, and high desert. There is no gap. There is no natural pass that a railroad could use without climbing to impossible elevations. The highest peaks reach 14,000 feet. The lowest practical crossing points still sit above 10,000 feet, which is higher than any railroad had ever operated anywhere in the world. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad. The law specified that the Union Pacific would build west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento, California. They would meet somewhere in the middle. But the law didn't solve the engineering problem. It just made it someone else's responsibility to figure out. The engineers who surveyed the routes faced a geometry problem with no good solution. Going south meant crossing the Colorado Plateau, a maze of canyons that would require hundreds of bridges. Going north meant entering territory controlled by the Sioux and Cheyenne, who had already demonstrated their willingness to fight. Going through the center meant climbing over mountain ranges that rose more than 8,000 feet above sea level. The Central Pacific faced the Sierra Nevada, a mountain range that rises like a granite wall on California's eastern border. The Union Pacific faced something arguably worse. They had to cross the Rockies, the Laramie Range, the Medicine Bow Mountains, and the Wasatch Range. 4 separate mountain chains, each one capable of stopping a railroad cold. And going around meant adding hundreds of miles to the route, which meant millions of dollars in additional construction costs and operating expenses that would make the railroad unprofitable before it ever carried a single passenger. So they had to go through. There was no other option. The man who figured out how was a surveyor named Grenville Dodge. Before the Civil War, Dodge had spent years exploring the Rockies and mapping potential railroad routes for various companies that never raised enough money to build them. He knew the mountains better than almost any white man alive. In 1865, while leading a military expedition against the Sioux in what is now southeastern Wyoming, Dodge stumbled onto what he'd been looking for: a ridge between Crow Creek and Lone Tree Creek that provided a natural grade up to the summit of the Laramie Range. The elevation at the summit was 8,247 feet, which was still dangerously high, but it was the lowest crossing point for 100 miles in either direction. Dodge called it the gangplank. it would become the most important piece of geography on the entire transcontinental route. But finding a path is not the same as building a railroad, and what Dodge found was just the first obstacle of many. West of the gangplank lay the Laramie Plains, a high plateau swept by winds that could knock a man off his feet. Beyond that rose the Medicine Bow Range, where the route would have to climb through dense timber and cross gorges carved by rivers running too fast to bridge with conventional methods. Then came the Great Divide Basin, a desert where temperatures swung from 100 degrees in summer to 40 below in winter, where water was so scarce that the railroad would have to haul it in from miles away. Then the Wasatch Range, the final barrier before the Salt Lake Valley, where the mountains rose so steeply that the only practical route followed a canyon filled with boulders the size of houses. 500 miles of impossible terrain, and every mile had to be graded, tunneled, bridged, or blasted before a single rail could be laid. The Union Pacific broke ground in Omaha in December 1863, but serious construction didn't begin until 1866, after the Civil War ended and labor became available. By then, the company had hired a new chief engineer, a former Union general named Grenville Dodge, same man who found the gangplank. Now he had to build a railroad over it. Dodge's first challenge was manpower. The Union Pacific needed thousands of workers for a job that most Americans considered either impossible or suicidal. The company advertised in newspapers across the East Coast, promising steady wages and adventure in the West. What they got was a workforce unlike anything American industry had ever assembled. Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate, who had nothing to go home to, were Irish immigrants fleeing the poverty of the old country, former slaves looking for opportunity in the only place America offered it, Scandinavians, Germans, Mexicans, and men whose origins nobody bothered to record. These men came from everywhere. They spoke a dozen languages. They had fought on opposite sides of a war that killed 600,000 Americans, but on the railroad, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether you could swing a hammer, drill a hole, or haul a load of ties on your back. The workday began before dawn and ended after dark. A typical laborer worked 12 hours, with 30 minutes for lunch and a few brief rest periods when the foremen weren't watching. On the track crews, there were no rest periods. The rails had to be laid in sequence, and if one man stopped, the whole line stopped. And the hierarchy was brutal but clear. At the bottom were the common laborers, the men who shoveled dirt and carried ties. Above them were the skilled workers, the blacksmiths and carpenters and powder men who earned double wages for dangerous expertise. At the top were the foremen and contractors, the men who answered to the casements and made sure the work kept moving. At its peak, the Union Pacific workforce numbered over 10,000 men. They called themselves the Casement Army, after Jack Casement and his brother Dan, the contractors who organized the railroad's construction crews. Jack Casement stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds. He had served as a brigadier general in the Union Army and earned a reputation for driving men harder than they thought they could go. His brother Dan handled logistics, making sure supplies reached the railroad wherever the tracks happened to end that day. Together, they created a construction system that operated like a military campaign. The casement method worked like this. A survey party went ahead of everyone else, sometimes 50 miles or more in front of construction, marking the route with wooden stakes. Behind them came the grading crews, who leveled the roadbed, filled low spots with dirt, and cut through anything that stood in the way. Behind the graders came the bridge builders, who spanned every creek, river, and ravine with timber trestles. Some of these bridges were simple affairs, just logs laid across a gap. Others were engineering marvels, wooden towers rising 100 feet or more to carry the tracks across canyons. Behind the bridges came the track layers. This is where the casement system showed its genius. The Union Pacific operated a rolling headquarters, a train that carried everything the workers needed to survive and build. Bunkhouses on wheels, stacked 3 bunks high with barely enough room to roll over. A kitchen car that could feed 1,000 men 3 meals a day, every day, regardless of where the railroad happened to be. A blacksmith shop, where tools were repaired and horseshoes were hammered out. A telegraph office that kept the construction crews connected to the outside world. Even a mobile payroll office where workers could collect their wages and, if they were smart, send money home before they spent it all in the saloons. Every morning, the supply train moved up to the end of the track and began unloading iron rails and wooden ties. Teams of men carried the materials forward and laid them in place. The rails weighed about 500 pounds each and required a crew of 6 men to lift in position. Behind them came the spike drivers, who hammered the rails to the ties with 3 blows per spike. A good team could lay 4 miles of track in a single day. On flat ground, with good weather, the railroad advanced like a relentless machine. But the mountains changed everything. When the Union Pacific reached the foothills of the Laramie Range in the summer of 1867, construction slowed to a crawl. The roadbed now had to climb more than 1,000 feet over 20 miles. Every foot of that climb had to be graded into the mountainside by hand. This is where you need to understand what grading actually meant. Picture a slope covered with boulders. Some of them the size of wagons, tree roots that go down 10 feet into rocky soil, a surface that alternates between solid granite and loose shale that slides away the moment you cut into it. Now imagine cutting a shelf into that slope, 40 feet wide and perfectly level for mile after mile. The workers use picks and shovels. They use pry bars to move rocks too heavy to lift. They use black powder to shatter the boulders that couldn't be moved, and wheelbarrows to haul away the debris. Each wheelbarrow held about 200 pounds of rock and had to be pushed up planks laid across the excavation site, sometimes 100 yards or more to the dump pile. A grading crew of 100 men could move about 3,000 cubic yards of earth and rock per day under ideal conditions. On the steep grades approaching the summit, they were lucky to move half that, and the conditions were never ideal. At elevation, the air holds less oxygen. Men who could work 10 hours at sea level found themselves gasping after 6. The summer sun at 8,000 feet burns exposed skin in minutes. Afternoon thunderstorms rolled in almost every day, turning the worksite into a mudslide and filling the excavations with water that had to be bailed out by hand. Then there was the wind. The Laramie Range is one of the windiest places in North America. Gusts regularly exceed 60 miles per hour. Workers learned to anchor their tents with rocks because stakes pulled out of the ground. More than one man was blown off a cliff face while working on a cut. Others were struck by debris, picked up by the wind and hurled like bullets across the worksite. But they kept building, because the railroad paid them whether they were comfortable or not, and most of them had nowhere else to go. The workers lived in tent cities that moved with the railroad. These camps had names like Hell on Wheels, Julesburg, Benton, and Bear River City. They were lawless places filled with gamblers, prostitutes, and saloon keepers who followed the construction crews like vultures following a herd. A worker earned between $1 and $3 a day, depending on his skill. A track layer made less than a blacksmith, who made less than a powder man. Room and board came out of their pay, which meant the company got back much of what it paid out. The food was monotonous but filling. Beef, beans, bread, and coffee, every day, for months on end. The beef came from cattle driven alongside the railroad, and slaughtered fresh when the cooks needed it. The beans came in barrels that were reused until they fell apart. The bread was baked in mobile ovens that traveled with the supply train, turned out in loaves that were crusty on the outside and dense as brick on the inside. The coffee was strong enough to etch iron, and the men drank it by the gallon. Fresh vegetables were rare. Scurvy was common, especially in winter when the supply trains couldn't get through the snow. So were dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, diseases that spread easily in camps where thousands of men shared the same water supply and the same latrines. Medical care consisted of a handful of doctors spread across hundreds of miles of construction. A man who broke his leg might wait days for treatment. A man who developed a fever might be moved to a hospital car, or might be left in his tent with a bottle of whiskey and a prayer. A man who got seriously sick often died before anyone knew he was ill, and his body would be buried beside the track before the next shift began. What was left of their wages after room and board, most men spent in the saloons. There wasn't much else to do. The camps offered gambling, drinking, and companionship that could be purchased by the hour. A man who worked 12 hours drilling through granite wanted something to take his mind off the fact that he'd be doing it again tomorrow. And then there were the accidents. We'll get to those. But first, you need to understand how they cut through solid rock, because that's where most of the dying happened. The first major tunnel on the Union Pacific route was the Marianne Tunnel near Dale Creek in present-day Wyoming. It wasn't long, just 100 feet through a granite ridge that blocked the route, but it took 3 months to complete. They drilled it by hand. Here's what that means. A team of 3 men worked together. One man held a steel drill, essentially a long chisel with a pointed tip, about 4 feet in length. The other 2 swung sledgehammers, taking turns striking the head of the drill. After each blow, the man holding the drill rotated it slightly so the next strike would cut fresh rock. This was called double jacking. A good team could drill a hole 1 inch in diameter and 3 feet deep in about an hour. A single tunnel face might need 30 or 40 holes before it was ready for blasting. The noise was deafening. The ringing of steel on steel echoed off the tunnel walls. So loud that men who spent months on the drilling crews often suffered permanent hearing damage. The vibration traveled up the drill and into the hands and arms of the man holding it, causing pain that started as a tingle and became agony by the end of a shift. Imagine doing that for 12 hours a day, in a tunnel where the air is thick with rock dust and the temperature is close to freezing because the mountain holds cold like a tomb. Your arms ache from holding the drill steady against impacts that would knock a lesser man off his feet. Your lungs burn from breathing air that's more stone than oxygen. Your eyes sting from the dim light of candles that flicker every time a hammer strikes. Once the holes were drilled, the powder men took over. Black powder was the standard explosive for most of the Union Pacific's construction. And it's a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur that burns rapidly when confined, producing gases that expand and shatter whatever contains them. The powder men would pack each drill hole with measured charges, tamp them down with wooden rods to ensure a tight fit, insert fuses of varying lengths so the charges would fire in sequence, and then retreat to a safe distance before lighting the fuses. The idea was that the first charges would crack the rock face, and the subsequent charges would break those cracks apart into rubble that could be hauled away. When it worked, a single blast could break loose 50 or 60 tons of rock. The tunnel would fill with smoke and dust, and the crews would wait for it to clear before going back in to haul out the debris and start drilling again. When it didn't work, men died. A black powder is what chemists call a low explosive. It burns rather than detonates, which makes it relatively predictable. But the fuses were made of cotton cord soaked in saltpeter, and they burned at inconsistent rates. A fuse that should have taken 30 seconds might burn through in 10, or it might smolder for a minute and then go out, only to reignite when someone went back to check on it. Premature explosions killed powder men regularly. Delayed explosions killed even more because workers would return to the tunnel face, assuming the blast had failed, only to have it go off in their faces. The Union Pacific kept no official count of the deaths from blasting accidents. Estimates range from a few dozen to several hundred. The truth is probably somewhere in between. And we'll never know for certain because the railroad considered dead workers a cost of doing business, not a tragedy worth documenting. But black powder wasn't the only explosive they used, and the alternative was even more deadly. Nitroglycerin is a high explosive, which means it detonates rather than burns. The shock wave from a nitroglycerin blast travels faster than the speed of sound, shattering rock that black powder would barely crack. 1 pound of nitroglycerin does the work of 5 pounds of black powder. For tunnel construction, this was revolutionary. Holes that took an hour to drill could now break twice as much rock with a charge that weighed a fraction as much. But nitroglycerin is also spectacularly unstable. It's a thick, oily liquid that explodes on impact, when heated, when frozen, and then thawed. Or sometimes for no apparent reason at all. The men who manufactured it and transported it to the work sites lived with the knowledge that they might cease to exist at any moment. There would be no warning, no chance to escape, no time to say goodbye. The Central Pacific had already experienced the horror of nitroglycerin when a batch exploded at their Sacramento works in 1866, killing 6 men and destroying several buildings. The blast was heard miles away. The bodies were never recovered, just scattered fragments that had to be identified by the clothing that remained. After that, California banned its manufacture and transport within the state. The Union Pacific had no such restrictions, and the railroad was in a hurry. Nitroglycerin arrived at the construction camps in wooden crates marked "Handle with care." The powder men treated these crates like live snakes, carrying them with agonizing slowness, setting them down on soft ground, and praying the entire time. The procedure for using nitroglycerin was the same as black powder. Drill the holes, insert the charge, run the fuse, retreat, and fire. But the margin for error was essentially zero. A jar of nitroglycerin bumped against a rock could detonate. A fuse that burned too fast gave no warning. A charge that didn't fire couldn't be removed because any attempt to dig it out might set it off. The solution, if you can call it that, was to drill another hole next to the failed charge and fire a new blast, hoping the explosion would either detonate the old charge or bury it deep enough that it wouldn't matter. This didn't always work. Some tunnels on the transcontinental route contained unexploded charges for years after construction, waiting for a pickaxe or an unlucky footstep to trigger them. The most dangerous work happened at Sherman Summit, the highest point on the entire transcontinental railroad. At 8,247 feet, the air at Sherman holds about 75% of the oxygen available at sea level. Men who weren't acclimated found themselves exhausted after minimal exertion. The powder men, who needed steady hands and clear judgment, worked in conditions that impaired both. The summit itself required relatively little tunnel work thanks to Dodge's gangplank route, but the approaches on both sides demanded massive grading cuts, and some of them sliced 100 feet deep through solid rock. One of these cuts, near present-day Buford, Wyoming, took 6 months to complete. Workers called it the Big Cut. It was 800 feet long, 60 feet wide, and cut through granite so hard that drill bits dulled after just a few inches of penetration. The Big Cut consumed more black powder than any other single feature on the Union Pacific line. Blast after blast echoed across the high plains, and the rubble piles grew until they formed small hills on either side of the excavation. At least a dozen men died in the Big Cut, though records are incomplete. Some were killed by blasts, others were crushed by falling rock. One man was struck by a runaway ore cart and pushed into an excavation pit, where he suffocated under debris before his crew could dig him out. His name is not recorded. Neither are the names of most men who died building the Transcontinental Railroad. What we do know is that the work continued, every day, 7 days a week in every kind of weather. Winter construction was especially brutal. The Laramie Range receives heavy snow from November through April, with accumulations that can reach 20 feet or more in the passes. Temperatures drop to 30 below zero. Winds create drifts that bury work sites overnight. The Union Pacific didn't stop for winter. They couldn't. The Pacific Railroad Act paid the railroad by the mile, with bonuses for difficult terrain. Every day they didn't build was money lost. So the workers graded through frozen ground that shattered picks and bent shovels. They drilled through rock so cold it burned exposed skin on contact. They hauled supplies on sleds when the ground was too snow-covered for wagons. Frostbite was epidemic. Men lost fingers and toes, sometimes entire hands and feet, to the cold. So was snow blindness, a painful condition caused by sunlight reflecting off snow. Men wrapped their faces in cloth until only their eyes showed, and even then, many suffered burns and blisters that took weeks to heal. The railroad kept building. By the spring of 1868, the Union Pacific had crossed the summit and begun descending the western slope toward the Laramie Plains. The worst of the mountain construction was behind them, but hundreds of miles of difficult terrain still lay ahead. The Medicine Bow Range required more cuts and fills, more bridges over rushing streams, more grading through forests so dense that clearing the right-of-way was its own massive undertaking. An advance crew went ahead of the graders with axes and saws, They cut down every tree within 100 feet of the route, then used teams of oxen to drag the logs away. The stumps were pulled out with chains or blasted in place with black powder. What they left behind was a scar across the landscape, a raw brown wound that would take decades to heal. The timber had one advantage. Unlike the mountain crossings, the forest provided material for construction. Ties were cut on site, hauled to the roadbed, and laid in place while still green. Trestle bridges used local timber, reducing the load on the supply trains, but green wood warps as it dries. Ties laid in 1868 needed replacement by 1870, and bridges sagged under loads they were designed to carry. The Union Pacific would spend years rebuilding track that was barely functional when first completed. They didn't care. They were racing. The Central Pacific had blasted through the Sierra Nevada and was now building east across the Nevada desert. Every mile the Union Pacific failed to complete was a mile the Central Pacific could claim, and the Pacific Railroad Act paid the same rate regardless of who built the track. The race became an obsession. The Casement brothers pushed their crews harder than ever. Track-laying records fell week after week. In April 1869, the Union Pacific crews laid 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that still stands for manual railroad construction. But speed came at a cost. When you lay track quickly, you cut corners. Grade that should be level isn't quite. Curves that should be gentle are too sharp. Bridges that should have solid footings rest on temporary supports. The Union Pacific line from 1869 was barely safe for the slow trains of that era. It would require continuous rebuilding for the next 20 years, and the human cost was staggering. We'll never know exactly how many men died building the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific kept no systematic records of worker deaths. When a man was killed on the job, his name was sometimes entered in a payroll ledger with the notation, "Discharged, deceased." Sometimes not even that. He was simply removed from the roster as if he had quit and walked away. The Central Pacific kept better records, which show that about 1,200 Chinese workers died on that line alone. Proportional estimates suggest the Union Pacific death toll was similar. Between both railroads, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men died building the transcontinental route. That's roughly 1 death per mile. Some died from blasting accidents. Some fell from bridges or cliff faces. Some were crushed by rockfalls or runaway equipment. Some froze to death in winter storms. Some died of disease in the crowded camps, and some were murdered. The railroad towns were violent places. Gambling debts, disputes over women, ethnic tensions, and simple drunken rage all contributed to a murder rate that would horrify modern Americans. Julesburg, Nebraska, averaged 1 killing per day during its brief existence as an end-of-track town. A Bear River city saw 23 men killed in a single riot when vigilantes clashed with railroad workers who were trying to free a prisoner from the town jail. The railroad hired its own police force to maintain some semblance of order, but these men were often as violent as the criminals they were supposed to control. Justice was quick and rough. A man caught stealing might be hanged from the nearest telegraph pole. A man who killed another might be shot on sight, or simply run out of town. There were no funerals for most of the dead. A man who died on the line was buried where he fell, sometimes in a proper grave with a wooden marker, sometimes just covered with rocks to keep the coyotes away. The markers are long gone. The graves have been plowed under or washed away or lost to time. The men who built the railroad left almost no trace of their existence except the railroad itself. And even that has been rebuilt so many times that almost nothing original remains. But here's what you need to understand. These men knew the risks. They knew that working on the railroad meant they might die. They took the jobs anyway because the alternative was worse. The Irish immigrants had fled a famine that killed 1 million people. The Civil War veterans had survived battlefields where the dead were stacked like cordwood. The former slaves had escaped a system that worked them to death without even the pretense of compensation. The railroad offered them something that seemed almost miraculous. Regular wages, paid in cash, for work that had a beginning and an end. Build the railroad, and you could move on. Find a homestead, start a business, send money home to your family. The American dream. purchased with sweat and blood and the lives of men whose names we'll never know. That's what the Transcontinental Railroad really represents. Not just an engineering marvel, not just a feat of logistics, but a monument built from human desperation and human ambition in equal measure. Now let's talk about what happened when they finally finished. May 10th, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, a flat, windswept plain north of the Great Salt Lake, where the Union Pacific tracks from the east finally met the Central Pacific tracks from the west. Photographs from that day show two locomotives, nose to nose, surrounded by crowds of workers and dignitaries. The Jupiter, representing the Central Pacific, and the 119, representing the Union Pacific. Between them, on a single rail gap and a single tie, waiting for the final spike. The ceremony had been planned for days earlier, but rain delayed the Union Pacific delegation. When they finally arrived, both railroads were ready for the most photographed event in American history up to that point. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, held a specially made silver sledgehammer. The final spike was gold, cast in San Francisco and engraved with the names of the railroad's directors. The telegraph wires were connected directly to the spike and hammer so that the moment of contact would send a signal across the nation. Stanford swung and missed. Thomas Durant, the Union Pacific's vice president, swung and missed as well. The telegraph operator, who was supposed to tap out the signal when the spike was driven, clicked his key anyway. As across the nation, cannons fired in celebration. Bells rang in Philadelphia. Crowds cheered in New York. The nation celebrated the completion of something that had seemed impossible just a decade earlier. The actual spike was driven by a common worker whose name no one recorded. The golden spike was removed and replaced with an iron one, because gold is too soft to hold a rail in place. The silver sledgehammer went to a museum, and the trains began to run. The first regular passenger service crossed the continent in about a week, down from the 6 months required by wagon train. A ticket cost about $100 for first class, less for the immigrant cars in the rear, where passengers sat on wooden benches and brought their own food. The woman from Boston, who we met at the beginning of this story, I'm the one watching the cliffs fall away beneath her window. She was one of thousands who made that journey in the first year. She wrote in her journal about the terror of crossing Dale Creek Bridge, a timber trestle that rose 130 feet above a ravine and swayed perceptibly when the train crossed. She wrote about the cold in the tunnels and the heat on the desert crossings. She wrote about the strange sensation of traveling through landscapes that seemed to belong to another planet. What she didn't write about were the men who built the track beneath her. She didn't know their names. She didn't know their stories. She didn't know that 17 of them had died building the quarter mile of track she crossed in about 20 seconds. That's the thing about infrastructure. When it works, nobody thinks about it. The bridges hold. The tunnels are dark for only a moment. The train arrives on schedule. The only evidence of what it took to build is the landscape itself, scarred and shaped by the work of thousands of hands. 50 years after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, veterans of the construction crews gathered for reunions. They were old men by then, their backs bent from decades of labor, their hands still bearing the calluses and scars of their youth. They told stories about the summer of '68, when they laid track through country no white man had ever seen. About the winter when the snow piled higher than the locomotive's smokestack. About friends who died and were buried beside the track, their graves marked with nothing but a pile of stones. Most of those veterans died before anyone thought to record their memories. The stories faded. The names were forgotten. The railroad they built was torn up and rebuilt and torn up again until almost nothing remained of the original construction. But here's what I want you to remember. Every time you see a train, any train, running through mountain terrain, you're looking at something that was impossible before these men made it possible. They invented the techniques that every railroad since has used. They proved that human beings could move mountains, one drill hole and one explosion at a time. Think about what that actually means. Before 1869, the only way across the Rocky Mountains was on horseback or by wagon, a journey of months through territory where a single mistake could kill you. After 1869, you could make the same crossing in a week, sitting in a padded seat, watching the scenery roll past your window. The men who made that possible didn't do it for glory. They didn't do it because they believed in progress or manifest destiny or the expansion of American civilization. They did it because they needed the money, and the railroad was hiring. The cost was horrific: thousands of lives, countless injuries, families who never knew what happened to their sons and husbands and fathers, a trail of unmarked graves stretching from Omaha to Sacramento. We owe these men a debt we can never repay. The least we can do is remember that they existed, that they suffered, and that the world we live in was built on their broken bodies. That's the real story of the Transcontinental Railroad, not the Golden Spike and the ceremony at Promontory Summit, not the triumph of American engineering and American will. The real story is the men who swung the hammers and drilled the holes and lit the fuses. The men who froze and burned and fell and were crushed and blown apart. The men who built something magnificent and terrible and then disappeared into history as if they had never existed at all. 500 miles of railroad through the Rocky Mountains, built before bulldozers, before jackhammers, before dynamite was safe enough to trust. Built by hand, built by men, built at a cost that should make us stop and think every time we take for granted the infrastructure that holds our world together. Because somewhere, at some time, somebody died to make it work, and the least we can do is remember. If you found this story meaningful, there's another one you should see. It's about another group of workers who built something impossible and paid for it with their lives. Click the video on screen now, and if you made it to the end, subscribe. I tell these stories every week, and they need to be told. I'll see you in the next one.